What if the Bible once included a book that revealed the names of fallen angels, described a race of giants born from their sin, and foretold the arrival of a Messiah long before Jesus walked the earth, a book so disturbing it was hidden, hunted, and ultimately banned by the church? Not because it lacked authority, but because it said too much. Too much about heaven, too much about corruption, too much about a war between watchers above and kings below. The Book of Enoch was cast out, but it never disappeared. You might want to dim the lights for this one. Not because it's frightening, but because there's something sacred in the darkness. Something old, forgotten, and possibly forbidden. Imagine opening a book so ancient its ink is nearly dust, its parchment brittle as dried leaves, and yet every word inside pulses with fire. Not metaphorical fire, the kind that once got men burned at the stake for simply reading it. The Book of Enoch is not a myth. It's real. It survives in full. And while it was removed from most biblical canons over 1,500 years ago, it was never truly lost. It hid in monasteries high in the Ethiopian mountains, copied by candlelight, passed from hand to trembling hand by monks who believed they were guarding something divine and dangerous. But why? Why would early church fathers revere it, then reject it? Why would angels fall, take wives, and raise monsters? Why does this book speak of secrets sealed in heaven, and of a Messiah destined to return in judgment? And perhaps the bigger question, if this book wasn't supposed to survive, why has it come roaring back into modern consciousness? Over the next few hours, we'll walk through deserts and ruins, float through heavenly palaces and burning courts of judgment, and follow the thread of a mystery that stretches from before the flood to the last book of the Bible, and maybe beyond. So settle in. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts unwind. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You probably didn't expect him to vanish. Most ancient figures go out with a dramatic flourish, plague, war, divine wrath, something cinematic. But not Enoch. One day he's there, the next, he's simply gone. The text in Genesis doesn't bother with explanation. It offers only a whisper. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That's it. A man so intimate with the divine that even death couldn't touch him. You'd think the Bible would linger a little more on a man like that. Instead, Enoch's story dissolves into silence until somewhere in the shadows of Jewish apocalyptic literature, it resurfaces. The Book of Enoch, attributed to this same enigmatic figure, explodes with details that the Genesis account dares not whisper. The man who once merely walked with God is now depicted soaring through heavens, speaking with archangels, witnessing judgment, receiving visions of the end of days, and chronicling the rebellion of the Watchers. Somewhere between the sparse lines of canonical scripture and the thunderous revelations of his namesake text, Enoch becomes something more than human. A prophet, a scribe, perhaps even a prototype for something divine. What made him worthy of that? He was seventh from Adam, a detail the ancients didn't take lightly. In numerology of the time, 7 signified completion, wholeness, sacred design. He stood at the pivot point between Eden and catastrophe, innocence and flood. The descendants of Cain had spiraled into corruption. The world teetered on the edge. And then there was Enoch walking, watching, writing. In the Enochic tradition, he wasn't just a passive witness, but an intercessor between heaven and earth. He pleaded for mercy. He recorded divine decrees, and he did it all while remaining utterly alone in his knowledge. Everyone else was busy building empires or weapons or golden calves. Enoch. He was writing visions. According to the Book of the Watchers, the earliest layer of the Enochic corpus. The angels didn't just fall, they chose to fall. They descended upon Mount Hermon, took mortal wives, and produced children of unspeakable size and appetite. But before judgment came, they turned to Enoch. They asked him to speak to God on their behalf. They begged, and curiously God listened, though not in the way they hoped. The messengers of heaven were given an answer. It was Enoch who delivered it. Enoch who walked between heaven's court and earth's grave. Enoch who stood between divine fury and the trembling remnants of creation. It's tempting to ask whether this is history or myth, but maybe that misses the point. What matters is that for certain communities, particularly the Essenes and early Christian mystics, Enoch became the archetype of heavenly vision and moral clarity. He was what a prophet looked like before the prophets had names. He was the original intermediary, and maybe, just maybe, he knew too much. Some scholars have suggested that Enoch's narrative served a strategic purpose. At a time when Jerusalem's priesthood was entangled in corruption and Roman politics, a figure like Enoch outside the temple beyond institutional control became an ideal mouthpiece for cosmic justice. He didn't inherit his authority. He earned it through proximity to the divine. This made him dangerous to some, convenient to others. What's more intriguing is how Enoch's legacy bled into other traditions. In later rabbinic texts, he becomes Metatron, a celestial being of terrifying authority, seated beside God himself. Not quite God, not quite angel, something in between. Think heavenly executive assistant with flaming robes. And in Islam, he's called Idris, a prophet, a sage, a man raised to the heavens. Across three major Abrahamic religions, Enoch emerges, disappears, and then reappears, upgraded. The questions around him multiply the deeper you go. Was he an invention of later scribes trying to stitch together moral allegory with mystical cosmology? Was he a folk hero lifted from oral tradition and remade into a proto-messiah? Or was he, as some quietly believe, one of the last humans to be invited into heaven? Alive. Even the Gospels can't help but echo him. When Jesus ascends into heaven bodily, the parallel is hard to ignore. And when Jesus speaks of angels' judgment and the coming of the Son of Man, phrases laced throughout the Book of Enoch, it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like legacy. It's curious that we so often remember Noah, but forget the man who warned the world before the flood. Noah built the ark. Enoch built the warning. And so we begin with a man who never died, who walked into heaven and didn't come back empty-handed. A man who became the custodian of secrets too heavy for his age and maybe too heavy for ours. The first thing to understand is this: we were never meant to have the Book of Enoch. Not today, not in this form. According to every official list of what should and shouldn't be in the Bible, compiled painstakingly by councils, bishops, and the occasional grumpy emperor, Enoch was out, buried, forgotten, declared apocryphal, and cast into the flames of theological quarantine. And yet, here we are, reading it, quoting it, unraveling its mysteries one dusty page at a time. It's the literary equivalent of finding a locked room in your house you never knew existed, and inside someone's been writing warnings on the walls. Its survival is not just strange, it's borderline miraculous. The full text of Enoch exists today, primarily because a group of Ethiopian monks, hidden high in the mountains of Tigray and Gondar, quietly copied it for centuries in the ancient Ge'ez language. They revered it, canonized it even. To the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Book of Enoch was never heresy, it was scripture. While Rome and Constantinople burned and edited and debated, these monks simply lit candles and wrote. No crusades, no councils, just preservation. And that's where the modern story begins. In 1773, an adventurous Scottish explorer named James Bruce traveled to Ethiopia allegedly in search of the Nile's source. Instead, he returned with something far rarer, 3 Jayas manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, tucked inside his luggage like divine contraband. When he presented them in Europe, the reaction was complicated. Some dismissed them as folklore. Others recognized them as something far more significant. Scholars who had seen only fragments in Greek or Aramaic suddenly held the entire book complete with its arcane visions and cosmic scandals. It wasn't just the content that shocked them, it was the implications. For centuries, the Book of Enoch had been thought lost. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Origen had mentioned it reverently. The Epistle of Jude had even quoted it directly, but after the 4th century, it vanished. Church leaders like Athanasius had begun drawing hard lines between what belonged in the canon and what didn't. Enoch didn't make the cut. Perhaps it was too strange, too celestial, too prophetic in ways that complicated the theological narrative being shaped. And yet, like some desert ghost, it had survived. The most curious twist came later in the caves above Qumran, near the shores of the Dead Sea. There, amid fragments of Isaiah Psalms, temple scrolls, and community rules, archaeologists unearthed bits of the Book of Enoch, written not in Ge'ez, but in Aramaic. It was undeniable proof that the text had once circulated widely among Second Temple Jews. And more than that, it had been central to a sect known for its apocalyptic fervor, the Essenes. These weren't casual readers. The Essenes treated the Book of Enoch as divine revelation. They aligned their calendar with it. Their rituals echoed its warnings. Some even believed they were the sons of light foretold in Enoch's visions, destined to battle the corrupt priests and bring about cosmic judgment. Suddenly, Enoch wasn't just back. He was prophetic again. There's something deeply ironic about this. A book banned for being too dangerous survives not because of imperial protection or church endorsement, but because of deserts, caves, and a handful of monks who believed too strongly to stop copying. It's almost as if the book itself refused to die. Like Enoch, there's an obscure debate still swirling among scholars that suggests the Book of Enoch wasn't merely preserved, it was protected. Some point to the Ethiopian tradition that Enoch's teachings came from the Ark of the Covenant smuggled south after the fall of Jerusalem. Others suggest that Solomon's lineage, which Ethiopian royalty claimed descent from, was tied to the preservation of apocalyptic texts. These are theories, of course. But in the quiet rooms of certain monasteries, they are held as truths whispered in the old language. And then there's the question no one really wants to answer. Why did the Western Church go to such lengths to erase it? It wasn't just the stories of angels misbehaving or giants rampaging. The Book of Enoch offered a cosmology that competed with Genesis, a judgment narrative that bypassed temple sacrifices, a messianic figure who existed before creation and returned in flames. For the early architects of orthodoxy, it was a liability. For the mystics and the marginalized, it was revelation. You can almost imagine the book sitting quietly on a monastery shelf for centuries, wrapped in goat leather and smoke, waiting for someone to ask the right question. And now, here we are asking it. It always starts the same way something descends from the sky. Sometimes it's fire, sometimes it's wrath. But in the Book of Enoch, it was angels. Not the harp-playing, robe-wearing kind your grandma might hang on a Christmas tree. These were warriors, observers, watchers. And what they watched, they wanted. Their descent was not sanctioned. That much is clear. According to the Book of the Watchers, a group of 200 angels came down from the heavens and landed on Mount Hermon, an ancient peak in modern-day Lebanon, whose name would soon carry a curse. These beings were led by a chief named Semjaza, though he wasn't the only voice in the dark. Others like Azazel and Arachiel soon gained notoriety for what came next. These weren't messengers on divine errand. They were deserters abandoning heaven for earth and desire for duty. But why did they fall? The text offers a reason so human it almost feels blasphemous. They saw the daughters of men, and they were beautiful. Yes, the original cosmic disaster was basically a divine romance scandal. These celestial beings swore an oath on the very mountain they landed upon to take human wives, bear children, and share secrets. It wasn't just rebellion, it was collaboration. A heavenly intelligence leak with very earthly consequences. One can't help but feel the tension in the scene. Angels shimmering with heavenly knowledge descending like twilight shadows, making pacts in ancient tongues, whispering promises to mortals who had no idea what was being offered or what was at stake. Mount Hermon became more than a location. It became a threshold, not quite earth, not quite heaven. A place where the boundaries blurred. Some believe the choice of this mountain wasn't arbitrary. In Canaanite tradition, Hermon had already been associated with the divine. It stood high above the plains, visible for miles, a perfect stage for an act of cosmic defiance. What followed their descent would shake the foundations of the world. Their offspring, known as the Nephilim, were not just children. They were giants, violent, ravenous, and uncontrollable. The Watchers, in their lust and pride, hadn't created a new golden age. They'd created monsters. But the scandal didn't stop at genetics. The Watchers brought gifts, not birthday party gifts, secrets, technologies, forbidden knowledge. Semjaza taught enchantments. Azazel taught metallurgy and weapon-making. Others brought astrology, root-cutting cosmetics. Yes, even eyeliner made the list. Somewhere in the divine ledger of sins, there's apparently an asterisk next to mascara. Civilization itself, medicine, warfare, beauty was suddenly accelerated. Humanity was given fire not by Prometheus, but by beings far more alien and far less generous. This raises a troubling question. Were the Watchers the villains, or the original revolutionaries? Some scholars have pointed out that Enoch's version of events doesn't just condemn the Watchers, it acknowledges their appeal. Humanity didn't resist the gifts. They embraced them, welcomed them, perhaps even worshipped the bringers. There's an obscure line in an Aramaic fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls that suggests temples were raised to the Watchers. Statues may have been carved, songs written. Not exactly the behavior of a terrified populace. Which leaves us with a lingering suspicion maybe the Watchers didn't just descend. Maybe they were invited. The Church Fathers weren't fond of this narrative. Too many celestial beings acting independently. Too much agency. Too much ambiguity. The idea that angels could fall not because of pride, but because of love, or at least lust, muddied the waters of orthodox theology. So the story was trimmed, retold, reduced to footnotes. But the Book of Enoch refuses to let us look away. It paints the descent of the Watchers not as a myth, but as a historical rupture. Something that happened once and changed everything. A cosmic infection that spread from the peak of a mountain into the bloodstream of human civilization. And still, the mountain remains. Mount Hermon hasn't gone anywhere. Tourists climb it now, oblivious to the celestial crime scene beneath their feet. There's a story, likely apocryphal, but deliciously poetic, that during World War I, a group of British soldiers camping near Herman reported lights in the sky and the sound of chanting. No records, no confirmation, just whispers. The watchers fell. That much is agreed upon. But whether they were cast out or chose to fall is still up for debate. They didn't sneak in. They didn't hide their intentions. When the watchers made their vow atop Mount Hermon, they did it together loudly, solemnly, and with full awareness of what they were about to break. Heaven, after all, was built on obedience. Earth, it turned out, was built on temptation. And the line between the two, a marriage contract of sorts, one that shouldn't have been signed. The Book of Enoch is unflinching in its account. These weren't one-night visits or chance encounters. The angels, beings of radiant power and unfathomable age, took human wives. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. They entered into union with mortal women, shared homes, shared beds, and raised something entirely new. It's tempting to imagine it romantically, in the way ancient poetry often bathes transgressive love in moonlight and soft harp music. But the narrative here is darker. The unions were not just biologically risky, they were cosmologically forbidden. These angels weren't built for Earth. Their essence disrupted everything. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were not beautiful hybrids of grace and humanity. They were nightmares. Giants in stature, but worse in appetite. According to the text, these children consumed all the food humanity could grow and then turned to human flesh. A sentence you never want to read in the middle of the night. But it's there. The result of divine affection gone rogue wasn't enlightenment, it was violence. The skies gave us poetry. The earth bled. What's especially curious is how the blame is distributed. While Semjaza is often painted as the ringleader, it's Azazel who seems to draw the sharpest ire from the heavenly court. He, we're told, taught men how to make swords and women how to wear makeup, suggesting a strange moralistic fusion of war and vanity. The implication is clear: the fall of angels didn't just lead to giants. It led to seduction, manipulation, a world turned outward, obsessed with power and appearance. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Some early church thinkers like Tertullian believed this passage wasn't just history, it was warning. They saw the sins of the Watchers replaying in Rome's decadence, in its weaponized religion, its painted faces, and gluttonous festivals. In other words, forbidden love wasn't just a celestial scandal, it was a cycle. The biggest controversy, however, lies in the nature of the women themselves. Were they victims, willing partners? The Book of Enoch doesn't give them names, which has led to considerable debate. Some modern scholars argue that this omission reflects patriarchal bias, a literary blind spot, in a text otherwise overflowing with cosmic agency. Others claim the women were symbols, stand-ins for humanity's openness to corruption. But there's one theory rarely spoken aloud that adds an even stranger dimension. What if the women were chosen not for beauty, but for bloodline? Some mystics argue that the Watchers didn't just fall out of lust, but strategy. They selected women from specific lineages, those tied to pre-flood wisdom or spiritual sensitivity. In this reading, the unions were experiments, breeding projects, and the Nephilim weren't accidents, they were prototypes. Unsurprisingly, that theory hasn't made it into many Sunday school pamphlets. Still, one can't help but notice the echoes. In Greek mythology, gods fall in love with mortals. In Mesopotamian lore, divine beings descend and meddle in human affairs. Even in Genesis, the phrasing is peculiar. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. It's a line that feels borrowed, a remnant of something older. something that refused to die no matter how much editing occurred over the centuries. What's undeniable is that the unions marked a point of no return. Before the marriages, humanity was corruptible. After them, it was corrupted. And that corruption spread not just in bloodlines, but in ideas, in technologies, in whispered rituals passed down like family heirlooms. The Watchers didn't just fall from heaven, they fell into us. It's easy to dismiss it all as myth. A strange story told by desert mystics with a flair for the dramatic. But then you look around. You see empires built on secrets, technologies we barely understand, a species obsessed with its own reflection. And somewhere in the distance you hear that whisper again, they took wives and taught them charms. They were called Nephilim, the fallen ones. Not because they tripped on the stairs, but because they were the consequence of those who had already fallen from grace. The children of angels and humans living proof that some boundaries were never meant to be crossed. According to the Book of Enoch, they were giants both in stature and in hunger, and once they arrived, the earth would never be the same. The ancient texts do not sugarcoat it. These weren't gentle giants or misunderstood outcasts. The Nephilim were monstrous, towering, grotesque, and violent. Their appetites were legendary. First, they consumed all the food their mortal neighbors could offer. Then they turned on the people themselves. The earth, Enoch writes, cried out beneath them. Blood soaked the soil. And the Watchers, their angelic fathers, looked on helplessly, either too arrogant or too terrified to intervene. Historical records outside of Enoch seem to nod to something similar. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, the titular character is described as 2/3 divine, 1/3 man, a towering figure who wrestled lions and defied the gods. In Greek mythology, the Titanomachy speaks of wars between gods and giant offspring. Even Genesis, usually tight-lipped about such things, casually mentions that there were giants in the earth in those days. A throwaway line unless you know what you're looking for. But what separated the Nephilim from the humans around them wasn't just size. It was power. Superhuman strength, yes, but also knowledge. Taught the secrets of heaven by their fathers, they wielded early technologies, destructive tools, and perhaps something more intangible, dominion. People feared them, worshipped them. In some darker theories, built temples for them. There are even fringe archaeologists who point to megalithic ruins, impossibly large stones, impossibly precise cuts, and whisper the word Nephilim under their breath, as if saying it too loud might wake something. One of the more obscure and controversial Enochic fragments describes a period of open war between the Nephilim. Apparently, they didn't just devour humanity. They turned on each other. Their insatiable egos clashed. Territories were marked. Alliances shattered. It was divine blood against divine blood, like a family reunion hosted by a nuclear reactor. This war, the text hints, may have accelerated the decay of the world. Humanity wasn't just collateral damage, it was the battlefield. And this is where things take a darker turn. According to some Jewish mystical traditions, the souls of the Nephilim did not perish with their bodies. Their hybrid nature barred them from heaven, and their monstrous deeds barred them from rest. Instead, their spirits were cursed to wander, disembodied, tormented, seeking vessels. Some traditions link them directly to the origin of demons, those restless spirits who possess torment and deceive. Not fallen angels, but the orphaned souls of hybrid giants looking for a body to wear like a second skin. Now pause for a second. That's a chilling thought. Every time someone in the ancient world claimed to be possessed, to be tormented by a shadow that wasn't theirs. What if they weren't talking about a devil? What if it was a Nephilim whispering through the cracks? Scholars still argue about whether these beings were meant to be taken literally or symbolically. Were they metaphors for dynastic corruption, kings so powerful they seemed otherworldly? Or were they real flesh and bone creatures who left their mark on history through violence and flame? Interestingly, there are modern claims largely outside the academic mainstream that trace giant skeletons unearthed in remote regions to the Nephilim legend. These claims usually come with grainy photographs, government cover-up allegations, and just enough pseudo-archaeology to make you lose an afternoon on the internet. But even if you roll your eyes at the stories, the persistence of the myth is striking. Giants keep showing up, not just in literature but in dreams, nightmares, murals on cave walls. It's almost as if we remember something, even if we've forgotten what it meant. The Book of Enoch doesn't flinch. It presents the Nephilim as a plague, a genetic and spiritual infection that contaminated the earth. Their war wasn't just between each other. It was a war against balance, order, and the design of creation itself. And once it started, there was only one way to stop it: a flood. It wasn't about a few bad apples. It wasn't even about human sin in the way Sunday sermons often frame it. According to the Book of Enoch, the flood that would wipe clean the face of the earth wasn't a judgment against humanity alone, it was a targeted purge, a cosmic intervention. Heaven's wrath wasn't stirred by broken commandments, but by a broken world twisted by angelic corruption, hybrid bloodlines, and violence that echoed into the heavens like a scream. The earth was groaning, not figuratively, literally. The land itself, the oceans, the skies, all of it, Enoch says, was crying out to heaven under the weight of the Nephilim and their chaos. Blood soaked the soil. Mountains trembled under the feet of giants. And the watchers, once luminous messengers of the divine, now crouched in caves or wandered the highlands, silent and cursed. They had taught too much, touched too much, and unleashed what they could not control. Heaven sent no immediate fire, no lightning bolts or plagues. Instead, it sent a messenger, Enoch. The man who walked with God was commanded to deliver judgment not as a prophet, but as a witness. He recorded the crimes. He warned of the reckoning. And then he disappeared again, leaving behind words like thunder sealed in parchment. In Enoch's vision, the Most High sits in a crystal palace above whirlwinds and rivers of fire. Around him, a host of angelic watchers tremble, not the fallen ones, but the loyal. They listen as the case is made. The evidence is reviewed, and then without much drama a sentence is handed down. The earth will be cleansed. The Nephilim must perish. The watchers must be bound. And humanity, well, some of it might be worth saving. This is where the narrative tightens into something eerily familiar. A man named Noah is chosen. But unlike the Genesis account, which presents Noah as a moral standout in a sea of corruption, the Book of Enoch emphasizes his bloodline pure, untouched by angelic interference. There are whispers in some translations that even Noah's appearance startled his father Lamech, who feared the child looked too radiant, too strange. An early sign, perhaps, of a divine fingerprint. Still, Noah becomes the vessel, the reset switch. But it isn't just his story anymore. It's the climax of a cosmic drama that began with angelic lust and ends with divine fury. The floodwaters weren't sent to wash away sin in general. They were aimed surgically, righteously, at the offspring of the watchers. The Nephilim were not to be exiled or rehabilitated. They were to be erased. Yet, as always, something slipped through. There's a brief but haunting note in the post-flood biblical text that says, "and also after that," referring to the giants. It suggests that the Nephilim didn't all perish, that some trace remained. A bloodline hidden a survivor protected a whisper clinging to the edge of the deluge. It's a tiny phrase, but it changes everything. Some have speculated that the survival of certain giants like Og of Bashan, a king described in Deuteronomy, with a bed over 13 feet long, proves the flood wasn't as complete as we've been told. Others suggest that while the original Nephilim died, their spirits remained earthbound and furious, birthing the concept of demonic possession in the post-flood world. Even more controversially, a few fringe scholars and mystics argue that the Watchers, though imprisoned, continued to influence humanity through dreams, symbols, or forbidden texts, buried deep beneath ruins no longer marked on any map. That the war they started didn't end with water, it just went underground. It's here the emotional core of the story creeps in. The flood wasn't an act of spite. It was sorrow. Heaven wept even as it raged. Enoch's writings reflect this complexity, justice wrapped in grief, a world so mangled by its own hunger for power and beauty that it had to be drowned to be healed. Modern readers often recoil at the flood narrative: children swept away, animals gasping for breath, entire cities crumbling beneath walls of water. But in Enoch's telling, the alternative was worse. A planet ruled by half-gods and monsters. A sky where angels broke oaths and shared weapons. A future where the divine was no longer distinct, but common, corrupt, and vengeful. So the deluge came. Not just a flood, but a cleansing. A reassertion of boundaries. Earth was earth again. Heaven was heaven. And the line between them drenched, yes, but redrawn. They didn't just fall, they taught. And that, in many ways, was the greater sin. The Watchers weren't content with defying divine law through forbidden unions. They also opened their mouths and handed out knowledge like cursed candy. The kind that tastes sweet, but poisons slowly. According to the Book of Enoch, this knowledge wasn't trivial. It wasn't how to grow better crops or fix a broken fence. The Watchers gave humanity what it wasn't ready to hold: the mechanisms of power, the mechanics of control. They gave us the blueprints of gods and the instincts of monsters. Take Azazel, for instance. If there were an angelic equivalent of Prometheus, except slightly more apocalyptic and less interested in fire, it would be him. He taught men how to forge swords and knives, shields and breastplates. But he didn't stop there. He taught women how to adorn themselves: bracelets, makeup, seductive ornamentation. In one sentence, the Book of Enoch links cosmetics and weaponry, beauty and bloodshed. A not-so-subtle warning that the same kind of knowledge can destroy differently depending on who holds it or who it's meant to influence. The implications are startling. Knowledge wasn't neutral. It had intention behind it. Taught by celestial beings, it arrived preloaded with consequences: root-cutting, enchantments, divination by the movement of stars, charms to bend desire, portents to time the perfect curse. 1,000 tools offered to a species still stumbling through basic survival. Like giving a toddler a match and a bottle of lighter fluid. And humanity, of course, embraced it. Some historians see this moment, the so-called Watcher Enlightenment, as an ancient allegory for the sudden leap in early civilizations. Cities like Sumer and Akkad, which seem to emerge with complex writing temple architecture and astronomical knowledge already in place, are often pointed to as possible beneficiaries of this divine leak. It's an uncomfortable thought that human advancement might have been kick-started by divine defectors. But the Book of Enoch frames it differently. It wasn't a gift, it was a contagion. The heavenly court didn't applaud the Watchers for their generosity, it condemned them. These secrets were sacred for a reason. Tearing them from the heavens and handing them to mortals was like slicing open the sky and letting chaos drip through. There's a line barely whispered in one Jay's fragment that suggests even the stars recoiled. The luminaries did not move in their seasons. It's as if the very mechanics of the cosmos stuttered at the audacity of what had happened. Even time perhaps flinched. And the humans, they didn't just absorb the knowledge, they turned it into hierarchy. The strong armed the weaker. The beautiful seduced the powerful. Kings emerged. Temples rose. Magic became religion. Weapons became kingdoms. Every advancement a watcher taught became a wedge between people and the divine. Not because the knowledge was false, but because it skipped the steps meant to prepare humanity for it. This is where scholars divide sharply. Some argue that the Watchers were misunderstood pioneers punished for pushing evolution. Others insist they were saboteurs, agents of corruption, cloaked in silver tongues and glowing eyes. And perhaps the most unsettling idea of all is this: both might be true. Because even today the echoes remain. The obsession with hidden knowledge, secret societies, symbols etched into architecture, currencies, and rituals, the need to know what the elite know, the suspicion that someone somewhere has been given the tools to rule unfairly. It recalls something Enoch wrote after receiving a vision, something often overlooked. He said that the knowledge of the Watchers would survive in whispers, in broken texts, in dreams. He warned that long after the flood, their secrets would rise again, not as teachings, but as temptation. And it's here quietly that we begin to sense a thread leading back to what came before. Mount Hermon, the vow, the descent, the oath to reveal what heaven had hidden. That original act wasn't just rebellion, it was instruction. The Watchers didn't want to destroy humanity. They wanted to reshape it, perhaps in their own image. And what does that say about us now, about the weapons we build, the chemicals we synthesize, the predictions we model from patterns in the stars? Are we carrying forward a gift or a curse? One might argue that we're still being taught. Not by winged giants or shadowed figures in caves, but by something older, something buried, something that still whispers. You'd think a cosmic betrayal of this magnitude would end with a lightning bolt, or at least a dramatic explosion. Instead, it ends in silence. Stone. Darkness. According to the Book of Enoch, when heaven passed judgment on the Watchers, it didn't kill them. It chained them. It's a strange form of punishment, isn't it? For beings of light and knowledge whose voices once cracked the skies, the sentence wasn't fire, but waiting, imprisonment, isolation in the most literal sense, buried beneath mountains, wrapped in darkness, hearing only their own regret and the echo of what they'd ruined. The text is specific. The archangel Raphael, always the one with a sense of order, was assigned to bind Azazel. His chains were to be iron, his prison beneath sharp stones in the wilderness of Dudael, a place whose exact location remains delightfully and perhaps intentionally unknown. Semjaza and the others were cast into pits deep below the earth, sealed until the day of final judgment. And thus, the Watchers vanished, but not completely. See, Enoch's description of their fate doesn't end with a tombstone. It ends with a countdown. The chains weren't forever, just long enough. The idea was never annihilation, it was containment, correction, which, if you're paying attention, is far more unnerving. Because it suggests they're still there, still conscious, still watching from the dark. The Qumran community, the same group responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, believed this passionately. They saw the world as a battlefield between light and darkness, not in metaphorical terms, but in actual bloodlines and spiritual contamination. They prayed for the final battle when the Watchers would rise and be destroyed. In their view, the current age was just an echo of that ancient rebellion, paused, but not concluded. Even the New Testament seems to nod toward this hidden drama. In 2 Peter and Jude, there are references to angels who sinned and were cast into chains, held in gloomy dungeons until the day of judgment. Coincidence? Not likely. The early church still had the memory of Enoch, even if it tried to bury the book. There's a curious tradition in Eastern Orthodox theology that speaks of Tartarus, a realm of shadow beneath even hell itself, where angels are held in bonds too terrible to describe. It's rarely preached from pulpits, probably because no one wants to think about what might still be awake down there. Then there are the mountains. All across the ancient world, myths attach themselves to mountains as places of origin or confinement or divine power. Mount Hermon, where the Watchers first fell, later becomes a kind of cursed peak. Some modern mystics claim that even today certain mountain ranges hum with unnatural energy. Tales circulate never in mainstream archaeology, of course, of strange magnetic fields, inexplicable disappearances, even visions. Whether that's imagination, high-altitude madness, or something else entirely, is open to interpretation. But what's not in dispute is the pattern. Every culture has its prison gods, its banished spirits, its bound titans. In Greek mythology, the titans were cast into Tartarus after rebelling. In Hindu cosmology, certain beings are locked away in subterranean realms until cosmic cycles allow their return. And in Norse legend, Loki's monstrous children are bound until Ragnarok. Chains are universal, and so is the fear of what might happen when they break. The question then isn't whether the Watchers were judged, it's whether they're still waiting. Some scholars suggest that the binding of the Watchers is an allegory, an ancient attempt to explain why the divine seemed so distant after the flood. The Watchers, taught us, then vanished. Their absence marked the beginning of the silence. The age of prophets would eventually return, but the era of open heaven, of walking with angels, of conversations like Enoch once had, that was over. We were on our own. Or maybe not entirely. There are claims, quiet ones, often ridiculed, that certain secret societies or occult traditions claim lineage from the Watchers. Not their blood, but their knowledge. That scraps of their teachings survived the flood, hidden in symbols, rituals, lost languages. That somewhere someone still hears them whispering. The Book of Enoch doesn't give a map. It doesn't tell us where the chains are buried, only that they exist, that they are real, that they rattle sometimes. So next time you're in the mountains and the wind shifts and the ground hums ever so slightly beneath your feet, you might want to remember something. Judgment in Enoch's world wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the waiting. He didn't die, he ascended. That's the part most people forget. While everyone else in the ancient world met some combination of plague sword or ripe old age, Enoch simply disappeared into the sky. One moment he walked the earth. The next he was navigating dimensions. And what he saw up there wasn't a vague cloudscape or the harp-heavy paradise of children's books. What Enoch saw was terrifying, blinding, precise. It wasn't just heaven, it was a system. The Book of Enoch describes his ascent not as a one-time rapture, but a guided tour. Think less stairway to heaven and more multi-level celestial bureaucracy with flame-resistant flooring. He was taken by angels passed from one guardian to another, each one stranger than the last. Some were as bright as the sun. Others were like burning bronze with voices of many waters. All of them had jobs, roles, departments even. As he rose, the air changed. Time fractured. The stars moved differently. He passed through levels of heaven, each more radiant, more organized, more disturbing than the last. The first was filled with winds and waters, repositories of weather and seasons. The second held rebel angels, now prisoners, weeping in silence. Higher still were records, libraries, vaults of knowledge that had never touched human minds. Enoch didn't just witness heaven, he audited it. And then he reached the throne. The vision is stunning, not just in scope, but in structure. Enoch saw the great glory seated upon a crystalline throne surrounded by flaming wheels and creatures too strange for zoology. The cherubim, the seraphim, the ophanim, all present, all terrifying. Not cute, not comforting. They were eyes within eyes, wings layered with wings, and a silence that vibrated with judgment. No harp music, no pearly gates. Just awe so dense it hurt to think. But what stands out most is how Enoch described the motion of the stars. He saw celestial luminaries not as dots in the sky, but as living beings, each with a name, a path, a purpose. The sun had its gate. The moon had its phases marked not just by time, but by law. Enoch's heaven was clockwork, brilliant, alive, and never late. Sin, he learned, was not just disobedience, it was deviation from design. This is where things get weird, and they were already pretty weird. Enoch didn't just look, he was spoken to. Angels revealed secrets to him, some too vast to contain, others whispered so gently they seemed designed to haunt. He was shown the coming flood, the judgment of angels, the Messiah to come. But most disturbingly, he was told that time itself would one day collapse, that the stars would stop their ordered paths, that heaven would open again not to receive but to descend. One can't help but notice the parallels between Enoch's vision and later apocalyptic texts. The Book of Revelation, written centuries later, echoes many of these themes. The thrones, the scrolls, the angels with loud voices and bowls of wrath. Some scholars argue that John of Patmos had access to Enochic traditions, if not the book itself, then the echo of its imagery. It would explain a lot. The obsession with order breaking down, the urgency, the dreams of fire. But there's also an older debate. Was Enoch's ascent unique, or was it meant to be repeatable in some strands of early Jewish mysticism, especially the Merkabah tradition? Enoch becomes the model for those who seek to ascend spiritually. Through meditation, fasting, chanting, one could approach the heavenly throne if only in vision. These mystics saw Enoch not as a distant prophet, but as a prototype, a roadmap. And then there are the Gnostic texts. In some versions, Enoch becomes an aeon, a being of light, forever navigating the planes between God and man. In others, he is a prisoner trapped by knowledge too vast to forget. But perhaps the most haunting element of Enoch's ascent is what he wasn't allowed to say. Throughout the Book of Enoch, there are moments when he is shown something and immediately told, "Do not record this. Do not speak of this. Seal it. Lock it away." One vision is described only as too fearful for man, which is both vague and frankly rude. It begs the question, what could be so terrible that even a man who saw the prison of angels wasn't allowed to speak it? Whatever it was, he carried it back with him, or rather left it behind for others to find. The ascent changed Enoch, not just in reputation but in nature. Some believe he became more than human, an archangel himself. Others say he became Metatron, the celestial scribe, seated beside the divine throne, writing still. But even if he didn't become immortal in body, his testimony did. It survived. Through scrolls, whispers, dreams, and a certain unease every time we look up and wonder, what's really watching from the stars? He thought he'd seen everything: clouds made of fire stars that sang angelic towers taller than reason. But what awaited Enoch beyond the gates of the upper heavens defied not only language, but logic. It began with mountains. Not the kind you hike or photograph, but 7 peaks of such magnitude and symmetry, they seemed more like thoughts made solid than geology. They burned not with flame, but with presence. Each one a different color, each one humming at a pitch that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the spine. The first was made of glowing alabaster, so smooth it reflected the heavens above it in perfect clarity, as if sky and stone were shaking hands. The second was black glass, endlessly reflective, yet absorbing all light that touched it. The third shimmered like molten copper under twilight. The fourth pulsed with an inner red glow, alive as if it breathed. The fifth was deep green, veined with silver like living vines. The sixth seemed to be carved from ice that would never melt. And the seventh, always the seventh, was impossible. Crystalline, transparent, and somehow brighter than any sun. Enoch couldn't look at it directly. He described it only in metaphor, like a song that has shape or a thought that becomes a palace. These were not just mountains. They were thresholds. Between them flowed rivers, some of fire, others of spirit, one that Enoch claimed was made of shimmering judgment. A phrase which frankly raises more questions than it answers. Angels moved among the peaks, not flying but gliding, their wings folded, their eyes turned toward a single structure that stood atop the 7th mountain. A temple. Not the kind made of brick and incense. This temple was light frozen into geometry, columns of glory rising into nothingness, domes that pulsed with the names of stars. Inside the throne, the center, the heart of divine administration. This is where things become disturbingly bureaucratic. According to Enoch, heaven wasn't chaos, it was administration. The angelic hosts had roles, titles. Some were scribes, others record keepers. Some served as watchers of time, others as whisperers of dreams. And at the core of it all sat the one unseen, unmoved, unchanging, the Ancient of Days. What's fascinating is the way Enoch describes the interactions. He wasn't just a guest, he was escorted, led by angels with names and temperaments. He wasn't always welcomed. Some looked at him with something close to pity, others with reverence. One angel, identified in later traditions as Uriel, reportedly told Enoch that no human had ever seen so much and returned, that he was being shown things not for his age, but for an age to come. The mountains themselves weren't decorative. They represented layers of divine order. Each one was a stage in the unfolding of history, law, and cosmic alignment. The temple, a kind of central processor for reality. When a star was to fall, the command issued here. When a soul was judged, the verdict echoed from these halls. But here's the most tantalizing detail. Enoch was shown a book inside the temple, a scroll to be precise, bound in materials he couldn't name, written in letters that danced. It contained not only the history of the world, but its future. Every king, every war, every quiet moment of heartbreak, the rise of empires, the fall of cities, and somewhere near the end, something strange, a return, a son of man, a throne beside the throne. Enoch wasn't allowed to read that part, but he felt it, and that feeling never left him. Some modern interpreters believe this crystal temple influenced later visions. John's Revelation, for instance, with its glassy sea heavenly court and scroll sealed with 7 seals, feels like a sequel. Others argue that the temple Enoch saw was never meant to be understood literally, but symbolically, as a representation of the ideal cosmos, ordered and luminous. But Enoch didn't speak in symbols, he spoke in descriptions. He didn't say it was like a crystal palace. He said it was a crystal palace. Which brings us to a rather uncomfortable realization. If heaven is this structured, this detailed, this specific, then maybe the rules matter more than we thought. Maybe rebellion isn't just sin, it's system failure. Maybe the Watchers didn't just break a law, they broke reality's architecture. And maybe, just maybe, those 7 mountains still stand. Invisible to us, perhaps, but not absent. They could be waiting, watching, resonating with memory. And if Enoch's record is even half true, they might be the first thing we see when the veil lifts. It wasn't a vision of fluffy clouds and golden trumpets. What Enoch stepped into next was a courtroom, a vast one. Not for mortals, but for angels. For ancient beings who had once shimmered with divine purpose and now stood in shame, their wings lowered, their light dimmed. The Book of Enoch describes a scene so strangely familiar that it's hard not to feel a chill, because justice, it turns out, looks a lot like judgment, even when it happens in heaven. The court was not empty. Thrones lined the perimeter, great looming structures that radiated presence, if not form. The Ancient of Days sat at the center, draped in robes whiter than snow, with hair like pure wool. Fire poured from beneath his seat, a river of flame. Not metaphorical, literal. The kind that burns memory more than flesh. Before him the accused. Not men, not kings, but the Watchers. These weren't trials in the human sense. There were no lawyers, no cross-examinations. The evidence wasn't argued, it was felt. Each Watcher stood before the court, and their crimes unfolded like scrolls written across the sky. Azazel, Semjaza, Armaros, they were named, publicly, their teachings, their lusts, their alliances with humanity, all exposed in the unblinking light of divine scrutiny. Enoch was not a passive observer. He was asked to speak, to intercede. The Watchers, those mighty beings who once descended in pride, now begged him to petition for them, to plead their case. But when Enoch brought their request before the throne, the answer was not forgiveness. It was finality. The Watchers had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. This heavenly council wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't vengeance. It was the cold machinery of a law older than stars. The judgment passed was surgical. The Watchers were to be imprisoned beneath the earth until the day of the end. Their children, the Nephilim, were to be extinguished. Their knowledge scattered, fragmented, buried so deeply in human consciousness that only dream symbols and madness would remember it. There's a strange tension here. The same Enoch who saw crystalline palaces and luminary stars now sees bureaucracy. Thrones casting votes. Decisions weighed not by emotion, but by design. It's easy to romanticize angels, to imagine them as harps and halos. But Enoch's court is a place of law, not lullabies. And those who transgress are dealt with in full measure. What's particularly unsettling is how familiar this scene feels. The courtroom, the judgment, the exile. Later religious texts echo it in countless ways. Satan's fall in Christian theology, Iblis's rejection in Islamic cosmology. The idea that once loyal beings could rebel and face a verdict. But Enoch's version predates them all. It's the prototype, the source code. And yet there's compassion woven in. Enoch, mortal and small, is asked to witness it all. Not because he's powerful, but because he's willing. Because someone had to carry the record. Someone had to tell the story. He doesn't intervene like a hero. He listens. He writes. He endures. There's an obscure debate among scholars about this courtroom. Some argue it was inspired by ancient Near Eastern royal courts, particularly the divine councils described in Ugaritic texts. Others insist it was entirely visionary, an original cosmology born from desert mystics staring too long at the stars. But whatever its origin, its legacy is undeniable. From the heavenly council in Daniel's visions to the judgment scenes in Revelation, the echoes are everywhere. Even in modern minds, we still cling to the image of a cosmic trial. Scales, books, a throne. A voice that speaks not in anger but in certainty. And if the watchers are the cautionary tale, what does that make us? Enoch didn't just return with stories, he returned with warnings. The courtroom was real. The verdicts were final, but the consequences, those were left to unfold across generations, through wars, through empires, through us. Maybe that's why so much of Enoch's writing feels urgent. Not dramatic, but grave. He doesn't plead for belief. He simply records what was seen. Because once you've sat in the courtroom of angels, everything else feels like echoes. Long before Bethlehem, long before a manger sat beneath a borrowed star, Enoch spoke of a Messiah. But not the one with sandals and parables, not the gentle teacher. The figure Enoch describes is older, stranger, and far more terrifying. He is called the Son of Man. Not in passing, not as a poetic flourish, but as a title, a role, a cosmic designation with weight and consequence. In Enoch's visions, this Son of Man sits beside the great glory. He is pre-existent, meaning he was present before creation, before time, before even the watchers fell. He is veiled in light, surrounded by righteousness, and destined to execute judgment not only on humans, but on angels. Yes, even angels. This isn't the Messiah most people expect. This isn't a figure born of meekness or sacrifice. This is someone with authority over all dominion, entrusted with books of judgment and the power to cast down kings. When he speaks, the nations tremble. When he rises, the stars shift. His return is not peaceful, it is apocalyptic. And here's where the story twists into something unsettling. The early church knew about this. They knew about Enoch's Son of Man. In fact, some early Christian theologians believed Enoch's prophecies pointed directly to Jesus. The language lines up with eerie precision. In the Gospels, Jesus often refers to himself as the Son of Man. Not Messiah, not King. That exact title. Over 80 times to be precise. It's not a coincidence, it's a breadcrumb trail. But the version in Enoch, he doesn't walk among fishermen or multiply loaves of bread. He judges from fire. He opens the book of the living and divides the worthy from the wicked. He doesn't teach gently, he arrives at the end of all things. So why then was this vision hidden? The answer may lie in power. After the rise of Constantine and the formal establishment of Christian orthodoxy, texts that conflicted with the Church's emerging narrative became inconvenient. The Book of Enoch, with its fierce Messiah, its pre-existent judgment figure, and its visions of cosmic upheaval, didn't play well with a Roman Empire that preferred order hierarchy and gradual salvation through church channels. Enoch's Messiah skipped the institutions. He answered directly to the throne. That made him dangerous. There's another layer to this buried in the sands of Jewish mysticism. In some Second Temple literature, the idea of a pre-existent Redeemer had begun to form a heavenly figure who would descend in the last days. The Son of Man, they believed, would crush the wicked, restore creation, and rule forever. Sound familiar? And yet over time, that version of the Messiah was carefully repainted, made more human, more docile, more aligned with empires that needed a savior who blessed kings instead of judging them. It's no wonder the Book of Enoch was removed from the canon. You can't exactly preach forgiveness when the pages are filled with fire and heavenly tribunals. Still, the prophecy persisted. In Ethiopia, where Enoch's words were never buried, the Son of Man remains a revered figure. Not just a future savior, but a present reality, watching, waiting, moving between the cracks of history. In that tradition, the Messiah is not merely a healer, but a judge, a purifier. The final voice in the final storm. There's an obscure teaching found in the similitudes of Enoch, a later portion of the text, that describes this Son of Man not as one who saves the righteous from judgment, but as one who saves them by bringing judgment. That's a sharp distinction. He doesn't avoid the apocalypse. He walks through it carrying those who can bear the light. This version of the Messiah doesn't flatter us. He doesn't ask us to be nice. He asks us to be ready. And for many religious leaders, ancient or modern, that's a much harder message to market. But then again, Enoch wasn't trying to sell anything. He wasn't building a movement. He was writing what he saw. And what he saw was a figure so radiant, so absolute, that even angels bowed. A judge with no shadow. A presence older than the stars whose face no one could look upon without trembling. Not a carpenter, not a rebel, but something far older and still waiting. It starts as a whisper, a pattern, a shadow between texts that were never meant to overlap until they do. Because once you've read the Book of Enoch, really read it, something about the New Testament starts to feel familiar, not plagiarized, not copied, but echoed, resonant, like a melody remembered from a dream. And at the center of that echo stands one question pulsing quietly beneath the pages of both books. Was Jesus walking a path that Enoch had already seen? Let's begin with the name Son of Man. Not a poetic title or throwaway phrase. It's the name Enoch hears again and again in his visions attached to a figure of unimaginable power. This Son of Man isn't just a cosmic tourist. He is enthroned, pre-existent. He judges kings, casts down the wicked, and walks beside the Ancient of Days as a divine equal. That's the same language, almost word for word, that Jesus uses in the Gospels when he describes himself, especially in moments of highest drama. Now you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. That phrase didn't come from thin air. For centuries, scholars have debated the origin of this title. Some say it's a humble term, Jesus distancing himself from messianic expectations. Others point straight to Enoch, arguing that the Son of Man motif had already been shaped in the apocalyptic imagination of Second Temple Judaism long before the Gospels were written. If that's true, then Jesus wasn't just using poetic flair. He was deliberately invoking a celestial identity known to mystics, scribes, and prophets. It gets stranger. Both Enoch's Son of Man and Jesus are portrayed as mediators standing between heaven and earth, carrying judgment, mercy, and mystery in equal measure. They both speak of the righteous inheriting the earth, the wicked being exposed, the stars trembling at their command. They're both tied to a book of life, a concept that doesn't originate in Revelation, but in Enoch's vision of celestial record-keeping. And then there's the ascent. Jesus, according to Acts, ascends bodily into heaven, an event witnessed by his disciples. Enoch, he walked with God, and was not, for God took him. Both vanish upward, both leave behind a legacy of celestial authority, and both are promised to return not quietly, but in judgment. Coincidence, maybe. But early Christians didn't think so. Several church fathers, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus Tertullian, referenced Enoch's writings with reverence. Tertullian in particular defended the Book of Enoch as scripture precisely because it aligned so well with emerging Christian theology. The idea that Christ had existed before his incarnation, that he would return as judge, that angels had fallen and warped creation, all of these were Enochic themes. So why didn't the Book of Enoch make the cut? Because theology, like politics, is as much about control as clarity. By the 4th century, as church councils hammered out canon and creed, the apocalyptic visions of Enoch became liabilities. Too radical? Too unmanageable? Too full of divine fire and cosmic architecture? They didn't want Jesus associated with sky courts and chained angels. They wanted a Messiah who fit neatly between Rome and heaven. But the fingerprints were already there. And they remain today if you know where to look. In parables of wheat and weeds, in warnings of sudden return, in the fierce, often uncomfortable reminders that the one who forgives also judges. The Book of Enoch isn't a contradiction to the Gospel, it's a lens, a backstage pass, a cosmic backstory that makes the drama of the New Testament feel less like an origin and more like a culmination. There's one more detail, small, obscure, but potent. In the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus is asked about the signs of the coming kingdom, he says, "Just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be." And in the days of Noah, according to Enoch, there were angels teaching sorcery, giants devouring cities, and a world groaning for judgment. Jesus doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. He assumes you've already read the prequel. So maybe the deeper mystery isn't whether Enoch and Jesus overlap, but whether they're two voices in the same story. One writing from the edge of time, the other stepping into it. The word apocalypse doesn't mean destruction. Not really. It means unveiling. A lifting of the veil. A glimpse behind the curtain that separates what we see from what truly is. And in the Book of Enoch, that unveiling is not gentle. It is relentless, vast, operatic. Imagine a clock tower made of stars suddenly cracking open to reveal that time itself has teeth and they are hungry. Enoch didn't just witness the fall of angels or the crimes of the Nephilim. He saw how it all ends. Or rather, how it must end, because once heaven's order is broken, something must give. His visions of the apocalypse were not vague allegories. They were detailed sequences, a chain reaction of cosmic justice starting with the sins of the Watchers and rippling outward through centuries, empires, dimensions. It begins with fire, not from volcanoes or warfare, but from the throne of glory itself. Rivers of flame pour from beneath the feet of the Most High, not in rage, but in precision, fire that separates, not consumes. Enoch saw stars falling from heaven, not as meteors, but as sentient luminaries abandoning their posts. Celestial rebellion, heavenly betrayal. The clockwork of the sky faltering, throwing seasons and sacred rhythms into chaos. Then come the trumpets, though in Enoch, they're less musical and more mathematical. Each blast initiates a shift in the balance. Mountains crumble, oceans rise, the sun changes course, and time itself begins to twist, as if reversing the damage that was done long ago on Mount Hermon, when the Watchers descended and rewrote the rules. What's especially haunting is the role of humanity in all this. Enoch doesn't portray us as innocent bystanders. We were complicit. The ancient kings who honored the Nephilim, the priests who welcomed forbidden teachings, the people who traded reverence for knowledge, they aren't spared in the vision. The apocalypse is not a divine tantrum. It is the inevitable collapse of a corrupted system, heaven's answer to centuries of contamination. But amid all the fire and judgment, there's a strange beauty. The righteous, Enoch says, will shine like the lights of the firmament. They will dwell in mansions of glory, their names written in the book of life. That book again, always the book. It contains not only deeds, but destinies. A record of the loyal and the lost of those who kept the light, despite the shadows whispering around them. There's a rhythm to Enoch's vision, a symmetry. Just as the watchers descended and corrupted the earth, so too must judgment descend and restore it. Every fall must be answered by a rising, every transgression by a reckoning. And at the center of it all stands the Son of Man, radiant and still as creation rearranges itself around his gaze. This differs from later apocalyptic texts in one critical way: it isn't escapist. Enoch's apocalypse doesn't whisk the faithful away to some ethereal realm. It remakes the world here. The earth is not discarded. It is refined, redeemed, reclaimed from the grip of those who would twist it for power. Modern readers often find Enoch's visions overwhelming, too strange, too ancient. But perhaps that discomfort is part of the point. He wasn't describing a movie trailer. He was describing consequence, a process that began with forbidden knowledge, with lust disguised as curiosity, with angels pretending to be gods. And like any system stretched too far, something eventually snaps. There's a quiet passage, easy to miss, where Enoch asks one of his angelic guides, "How long until these things come to pass?" The answer, when the number is full. No calendar date. No signs in the sky, just a number, a tipping point, as if creation itself is keeping score. Some believe we're already near that number. Others think it passed long ago. But the question lingers not just about when the end will come, but whether we're ready for a version of the apocalypse that doesn't offer escape, only exposure. Because in Enoch's world, the end isn't fire for fire's sake. It's fire that sees, fire that knows, fire that remembers who built the temples and who buried the truth beneath them. If knowledge is power, then timekeeping is control. Calendars are not just about months and moons. They decide when we feast, when we mourn, when we sow, when we sacrifice. Whoever controls the calendar in a very real sense controls the rhythm of belief. Which is why the Book of Enoch spends an unsettling amount of time, no pun intended, detailing the calendar of the righteous. Not as a footnote, but as a battleground. According to Enoch's visions, time was never meant to orbit the moon. That's right. The lunar calendar, so central to traditional Judaism, is framed in his writings as a corruption introduced by those who no longer walk in the light. Enoch presents instead a solar calendar made of 364 perfectly arranged days, 4 seasons each, precisely 91 days. No drift, no misalignment, no extra days tacked on by wandering moons, just order. This wasn't a casual suggestion, it was a correction. The angel Uriel, acting as Enoch's guide through the mysteries of creation, takes him through gates in the sky, literal portals, where the sun enters and exits, measuring time not by shadows, but by divine architecture. The stars are not decorations, they're instruments, clocks in a way. And the moment humans deviated from this sacred rhythm, they fell out of sync, not just with nature, but with heaven. Enoch writes this with urgency, even frustration. The festivals were wrong, the Sabbaths were misaligned, the offerings were mistimed, and as a result, the covenant itself began to fade, not because God withdrew, but because humanity lost the beat. Heaven was still singing, earth had gone off-key. Here's where it gets tense. This wasn't a purely spiritual argument. It was political. The Essenes, the apocalyptic sect who preserved Enoch's writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, were obsessed with calendar purity. They separated themselves from the Jerusalem priesthood, not just over theology, but over timekeeping. They saw the temple's lunar calendar as evidence of corruption, and they believed the restoration of true worship depended on realigning with the solar rhythm revealed to Enoch. So yes, there was a literal calendar war. temple authorities declared their feast days. The Essenes held theirs a week earlier or later. Pilgrims gathered by the thousands in Jerusalem, while the Essenes held private ceremonies in caves. And in their scrolls you can hear the scorn, "The world is out of step," they write. But the righteous will keep time with the angels. This isn't just ancient drama. It's a deeper metaphor. The Watchers corrupted the earth by altering knowledge. The Nephilim distorted justice by enforcing power. And now even time itself is suspect. Enoch's calendar becomes a symbol of resistance not just to earthly empires, but to spiritual entropy, a way to realign the ticking of human hearts with the silent metronome of heaven. And here's the twist: even modern calendars bear scars of this ancient war. The Gregorian calendar we use today revised from the Julian before it was built, not merely for astronomical accuracy, but to fix Easter's drift. The solstices, the equinoxes, leap years, daylight, savings our obsession with timing, reveals how fragile our grasp on rhythm truly is. We're still trying to fix a clock we didn't build. But Enoch didn't want to fix it. He wanted to remember it. His calendar was already perfect, unchanging. Like the stars he saw in heaven, always in their season, always returning to their gate. There's a moment quiet and strange when Enoch asks the angel what happens to those who ignore the true calendar. The answer is chilling in its simplicity: they will not be known. In other words, when the book of life is opened, their names might not align, their days, their deeds off, by just enough to miss the gate entirely. Is that fair? Is it symbolic, or is it a code we've never fully cracked? Some mystics believe that even today rituals performed in the wrong rhythm lose their power, that prayers offered on a lunar calendar may echo but never arrive, that certain gates of heaven of time only open when the stars above and the numbers below align. And if that's true, how many gates have we missed? Enoch's obsession with time isn't pedantic. It's prophetic, a reminder that even the ticking of a clock can carry truth or treason, that every day we mark may carry the residue of choices made by priests and rebels long forgotten, and that maybe, just maybe, there's a better rhythm still pulsing beneath our noise, if only we'd remember how to count. It was never meant to be found. Not again. And certainly not in the dry, cracked hands of a young Bedouin shepherd hurling a rock into a cave near Qumran in 1947. The shatter of pottery, the echo off stone, and suddenly the ancient world exhaled. Inside that cave, one of many as it turned out, lay scrolls wrapped in linen and time, fragments of lost scripture, records of vanished sects, and among them, pieces of the Book of Enoch. It was a rediscovery that changed everything. Until that moment, Enoch's survival had been largely thanks to Ethiopia, a beautiful anomaly preserved in Ge'ez, dismissed by the West as apocryphal folklore. But now here it was in Hebrew and Aramaic, tucked in jars older than empires. Not a fringe tale, but central to the worldview of one of the most mysterious communities in ancient Judaism, the Essenes. These were not casual believers. The Essenes lived apart in desert austerity, bound by strict codes and an apocalyptic sense of destiny. They considered the world irreparably corrupt. The temple a political puppet show. The priests compromised. And the calendar, don't even get them started. They saw themselves as the true sons of light preparing for an imminent war against the forces of darkness. And at the core of their beliefs was Enoch. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, multiple copies of Enoch's texts were found, some in nearly identical form to the Ethiopian version, others in fragments that hinted at even older layers. This wasn't some obscure curiosity shelved in a dusty corner. This was doctrine. This was blueprint. And the themes: judgment, fallen angels, celestial secrets, a coming Messiah, a reckoning that would reorder heaven and earth. If that sounds familiar, it's because Enoch's apocalypse was the scaffolding for theirs. The sons of light would rise, the watchers would be avenged, and time broken by corruption would finally be realigned. There's an oddly touching detail found in one scroll, a hand-copied calendar that maps Enoch's solar system onto real-world festivals. It reads like preparation, as if these desert monks weren't just studying prophecy, but rehearsing for it. Every ritual they performed, every scroll they copied, was part of a long, slow countdown. And then, silence. The community vanished. Maybe destroyed by Rome, maybe dissolved by disillusionment. Their caves were sealed by time and dust until a shepherd's stone cracked the seal. The modern reaction to the find was appropriately chaotic. Some scholars celebrated, others hesitated. The appearance of Enochic texts in Qumran forced a reconsideration of early Jewish theology. This wasn't fringe mysticism anymore. It was mainstream apocalypse. Enoch had been there all along, shaping the minds of those who anticipated not just a savior, but a showdown. This raises a delicate question. If the Essenes were right about the centrality of Enoch, what else were they right about? They claimed to be the final remnant of righteousness. They expected divine intervention. And they preserved a book that would vanish almost everywhere else for over 1,000 years. Accident or design? There's another theory, whispered more than written, that Enoch's reappearance through the Dead Sea Scrolls wasn't just archaeology. It was timing. That certain truths only resurface when the world is ready or when it's about to repeat its mistakes. Because Enoch's warnings weren't just about ancient giants and angelic scandals. They were about forgetting, about drifting off the path until you no longer recognize the stars, and about how knowledge, true divine knowledge, never really dies. It waits, in jars, in caves, in the hands of shepherds who think they're throwing stones at goats and end up breaking history wide open. And let's be honest, how many ancient scrolls have you found today? The odds are slim. The message apparently is persistent. A book once buried, banned, and burned, returned. Not in the halls of power, not through official channels, but in a cave in the desert among rebels who still believed in fire and stars and the possibility of a world that hadn't given up. It's easy to forget now, but there was a time when the Book of Enoch wasn't considered dangerous. It was considered essential. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, long before councils and creeds locked Scripture into neat boxes, Enoch's visions circulated freely among the faithful. They weren't whispers on the edge of orthodoxy. They were read, quoted, preached, revered. Take the Epistle of Jude. Nestled near the end of the New Testament, it openly cites Enoch by name. Enoch the seventh from Adam prophesied. Jude doesn't treat it as allegory or rumor. He treats it as fact, an authoritative voice predicting judgment with words worth inscribing alongside apostolic testimony. The irony is sharp. The very text later declared, heresy was once quoted as scripture. The appeal is obvious. Early Christians lived in a world trembling under empire persecution and uncertainty. They needed a framework bigger than Caesar, a vision broader than synagogue walls. Enoch offered exactly that. A cosmic courtroom, fallen angels in chains, a Messiah blazing with glory returning to judge not just men, but the powers that enslaved them. To believers awaiting Christ's return, Enoch read less like apocrypha and more like prophecy fulfilled. Church fathers noticed. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, defended the Book of Enoch vigorously. He argued that if Jude endorsed it, so should the Church. He believed its descriptions of fallen angels and forbidden unions explained the origins of demons, those restless spirits who tormented humanity. Without Enoch, he warned Christian theology lacked context. Origen, too, referenced Enoch's visions when discussing angels and cosmology, weaving its imagery into his vast spiritual maps. For a time, Enoch's shadow stretched across the developing faith. Baptismal rites, hymns, and early sermons hinted at its themes. The Messiah as Son of Man, the coming judgment, the flood as divine cleansing of angelic corruption. These weren't eccentric flourishes. They were mainstream ideas born from Enoch's pages and pulsing through Christian imagination. But reverence is fragile. By the 4th century, the political machinery of empire collided with the wildfire of apocalyptic expectation. Constantine had legalized Christianity. Bishops now walked in imperial halls. Stability, not upheaval, became the goal. Suddenly, texts that emphasized rebellion, cosmic war, and imminent judgment were liabilities. The Book of Enoch, once beloved, became inconvenient. And yet even in suppression, traces remained. Ethiopian Christians clung to it as scripture, canonizing it with equal authority to the Gospels. Monks in remote highlands copied it faithfully. Their liturgies still resonate with Enochic imagery, proof of an unbroken chain of reverence. They didn't rediscover Enoch centuries later, they never let it go. There's an obscure but telling debate among modern scholars about just how widespread Enoch's influence was. Some argue it shaped not only revelation, but also the language of the Synoptic Gospels, with Jesus' constant reference to the Son of Man echoing Enoch's Messiah. Others claim its impact is overstated, that it was one of many apocalyptic texts in circulation. But even the skeptics admit without Enoch, much of early Christian vocabulary about angels, demons, and judgment lacks roots. So why does this matter? Because it shows us that the earliest Christians weren't afraid of Enoch. They embraced him. He wasn't an outsider to their faith, he was woven into it. It was only later, when the church traded caves and catacombs for basilicas and councils, that his voice was silenced. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. The man who never died, the prophet who walked with God, revered by the first followers of Christ, banned by the empire that claimed his Messiah. Enoch still walking, still whispering, still too dangerous to forget. By the time the 4th century rolled around, the Book of Enoch had become a problem. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was remembered too well. It lingered in sermons, it echoed in Gospels, and it whispered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It had shaped the imagination of early Christians and terrified more than a few bishops. Which is why, when the canon of Scripture was hammered into shape by councils and emperors, Enoch didn't just get left out, it got locked out. Banned, buried, declared too dangerous to sit among the books of the Bible. So what exactly made it so threatening? On the surface, it looks like any apocalyptic text, angels, visions, cosmic drama. But dig deeper and you see why it had to go. Enoch revealed too much about the heavenly court. It dared to describe angels not as flawless servants, but as beings who failed spectacularly. It suggested that rebellion wasn't rare, it was systemic, that heaven itself had cracks. This didn't sit well with a church trying to project divine authority, stability, and a neat hierarchy of power stretching from God to angels, to bishops, to emperors. The last thing they wanted was a best-selling book that showed heaven's messengers as seducers, liars, and fugitives in chains. Then there was the Messiah problem. Enoch, Son of Man, is radiant, pre-existent, enthroned beside the Ancient of Days, coming in fire to judge angels and kings alike. That language bled into the New Testament so clearly that you can almost overlay passages from Enoch and the Gospels like transparent sheets. For believers, this was thrilling proof of continuity. But for the political church of Constantine's empire, it was destabilizing. It meant the Messiah wasn't owned by Rome. It meant Christ's authority existed outside imperial blessing, and that was unacceptable. Add to this the calendar controversy. Enoch's solar calendar directly opposed the lunar system used by Jewish priests and later adapted into Christian feasts. If Enoch was right, entire religious institutions were keeping time incorrectly. Festivals, Sabbaths, even Easter could be out of sync with heaven. That kind of claim wasn't just theological nitpicking, it was rebellion. Calendars determine power, and Enoch's calendar threatened to reset it. Church councils, especially those led by figures like Athanasius, began to tighten the canon. Their goal wasn't simply to preserve truth, it was to preserve unity. By excluding Enoch, they removed a destabilizing text that fueled apocalyptic movements, challenged hierarchy, and undermined control. They branded it apocrypha, dangerous, unreliable, heretical. Yet ironically, many of the same bishops had read it in their youth. Some had even quoted it. They didn't erase it because it lacked influence. They erased it because it had too much. But here's the lingering question. What were they really afraid of? That ordinary people would believe angels had corrupted the earth, that the Messiah wasn't theirs to define, or that Enoch's visions might be true. Even as the West buried the book, other traditions kept it alive. Ethiopian Christianity canonized it. Certain Gnostic sects whispered it in secret, and mystics across the Middle East echoed its warnings about angels, demons, and judgment. The ban wasn't universal. It was strategic, a wall built around orthodoxy. But cracks remained. Modern scholars still debate the ban's exact moment. Was it at the Council of Laodicea in the mid-4th century, where apocryphal books were condemned? Was it a gradual silencing enforced not by decree, but by neglect? The records are murky. But the outcome is not. By the 5th century, Enoch had vanished from the libraries of Europe. When the medieval world opened its Bibles, the 7th from Adam was missing. And yet, like the Watchers he described, Enoch wasn't destroyed. He was bound, chained in absence, waiting to be rediscovered. Perhaps the very act of banning him gave his book more power. After all, nothing is more tantalizing than a text someone insists you must never read. Which brings us back to the fear. If the guardians of orthodoxy had truly believed the Book of Enoch was irrelevant, they could have ignored it. Instead, they buried it. And the act of burial speaks louder than any condemnation. It says this book was dangerous. This book revealed too much. This book had to be hidden for the empire to feel safe. Safe from angels. Safe from prophecy. Safe from a Messiah who refused to sit quietly under imperial rule. Strange, isn't it? A man who vanishes from the Hebrew Bible with barely a sentence, whose writings were banned in the West, somehow resurfaces in another tradition, altogether Islam. There he isn't called Enoch. He is Idris, a prophet, a sage. A man who, like his biblical counterpart, did not taste death, but was lifted alive into heaven. If the story of Enoch is a river buried underground, then in Islam it emerges again, flowing under a different name. The Quran mentions Idris briefly, but with respect that borders on reverence. In Surah Maryam, he is described as a man of truth, a prophet raised to a high station. It's not much detail, but the phrasing is familiar. Raised, elevated, taken up. The same strange disappearance that defined Enoch's story in Genesis now reappears in Islamic scripture. The echo is unmistakable. Over centuries, Muslim commentators expanded this portrait. In some traditions, Idris is credited with wisdom beyond his years, a scribe of divine mysteries, the first to master writing and mathematics. Others say he taught people how to sew, how to read the stars, how to measure the heavens. The resonance with Enoch's portrayal as a visionary who mapped time and luminaries is impossible to ignore. Where Judaism and Christianity silenced him, Islam kept his memory alive in plain sight. What makes this even more intriguing is the way Idris sometimes overlaps with Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary founder of esoteric knowledge in the Greco-Arabic world. Medieval Islamic philosophers often fused Idris with Hermes, portraying him as a primordial sage who safeguarded ancient wisdom through floods and disasters. Suddenly, Enoch isn't just a prophet, he's a bridge between monotheism and mysticism, between scripture and science, between revelation and philosophy. But not everyone agrees on who Idris really was. Some scholars equate him with the biblical Enoch. Others suggest he might be Elijah, another figure said to have ascended without death. The debate itself feels like part of the mystery, as if Idris resists being pinned down, much like Enoch slipping out of history's grasp. Still, the majority view in Islamic tradition ties Idris most strongly to Enoch the seventh from Adam, the man who walked with God. What's striking is the consistency of his trajectory. In every tradition, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, he is not a prophet who dies, but one who rises. His role is never limited to his own generation. He belongs to the margins of eternity, always ascending, always glimpsing more than mortals should, and always leaving behind questions that unsettle the faithful. This continuity forces a hard question. Why does Enoch keep reappearing in the world's great religions even when others try to erase him? If his story were mere myth, wouldn't it have dissolved centuries ago? Instead, it survives in monasteries, scrolls, and surahs. It adapts, it hides, it resurfaces, almost like the man himself, never dead, just moved elsewhere. There's another detail, small but telling. In some Sufi traditions, Idris is said to occupy a station in the heavens, even now still alive, still guiding those who seek hidden knowledge. He is less a figure of history than of presence, active, invisible, watching. The same claim made by mystics in other traditions, who whisper that Enoch never really left. So what do we make of this? Was Idris a deliberate adaptation, a way for Islam to link itself to the ancient roots of prophecy stretching back to Adam? Was it an echo of stories carried by Jewish and Christian converts into Arabia? Or was it something more, that even when texts are banned, the truth they carry refuses to die? The Book of Enoch may have been erased in the West, but it still speaks through Idris. His survival in Islam is not just coincidence, it is continuity. Proof that the story of a man who never died is itself incapable of dying. And maybe that is the true warning. That even if you chain the watchers and burn the scrolls, even if you outlaw the prophecies and silence the sermons, the story will still surface in another book, another tongue, another faith. Because Enoch or Idris walked with God, and you can't erase a man who never stopped walking. While the Western world buried the Book of Enoch beneath centuries of silence, one place refused to let it go. Ethiopia. In its highland monasteries carved into cliffs and hidden in valleys, monks preserved the text with a devotion so unshakable it bordered on defiance. For them, Enoch was never apocrypha. He was scripture, not fringe, not forbidden, central. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church places Enoch within its canon alongside books like Jubilees that most of Christianity discarded long ago. This wasn't an accident of geography or a quirk of translation. It was conviction. They believed the words of Enoch carried divine authority every bit as weighty as Isaiah or Matthew. In their liturgy, the voice of Enoch still rings. In their theology, his visions still matter. The man who walked with God was never exiled from their Bible, because why would you exile someone God refused to let die? The story of how Ethiopia kept Enoch is itself almost mythic. Tradition holds that their connection to the text runs through the Queen of Sheba, and her son Menelik said to be the child of Solomon. According to Ethiopian lore, Menelik carried the Ark of the Covenant south from Jerusalem to Axum. Alongside the Ark came other treasures, possibly scrolls, prophecies, teachings. Enoch, they say, was among them. Whether historical or legendary, the narrative gave Ethiopian Christianity a unique self-identity. They weren't merely inheritors of the faith, they were its guardians, and they lived like it. For centuries, Ethiopian scribes copied the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez, their sacred liturgical language. When empires rose and fell, when Europe fractured under councils and schisms, when Rome declared Enoch forbidden, these monks quietly sharpened their quills, dipped them in ink, and wrote. Candlelight on vellum. Whispers of angels and giants preserved line by line. Their monasteries became time capsules, libraries against forgetting. There's a quiet, almost cinematic image in this. While the Roman Empire debated and deleted, Ethiopia kept vigil. A lone candle burning in the highlands, while the rest of the world sat in darkness. When James Bruce arrived in the 18th century and carried Enoch's manuscripts back to Europe, it wasn't a discovery. It was a reminder. Ethiopia hadn't lost the book. The rest of the world had. Why did they preserve it? Perhaps because Enoch's story mirrored their own. Ethiopia was never Rome, never Constantinople. It was a kingdom on the margins, often ignored, sometimes dismissed, but deeply convinced of its divine role. A book about angels who fell a flood that cleansed, and a Messiah who would return in judgment, fit perfectly with their self-image as a people chosen to protect forgotten truths. Enoch wasn't a problem to solve. He was a prophet to honor. And there's something else. In Ethiopian Christianity, the Son of Man described by Enoch was never an embarrassment. He was confirmation. Their theology didn't need councils to decide whether Jesus was divine, eternal, and enthroned. Enoch had already said it. The book was not a contradiction of the gospel. It was its foundation. To remove it would be to tear out the scaffolding. To keep it was to stay aligned with the original rhythm of heaven. This decision gave Ethiopia something no other branch of Christianity had: continuity. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed and fragments of Enoch appeared, Western scholars gasped at the revelation that Enoch had shaped Second Temple Judaism. Ethiopian monks simply nodded. They had been reading it for centuries. It makes you wonder, did they know something the rest of the world tried to forget? Did they recognize that once a man has walked with God, his voice should not be silenced? Or did they simply understand that sacred texts are not disposable? That if God had preserved Enoch in heaven, perhaps his people should preserve his words on earth. Whatever their reasons, the outcome is clear. Ethiopia became the keeper of a secret, a living library of a banned book. And thanks to them, the seventh from Adam still speaks. Not as a ghost, not as a fragment, but as a prophet whose voice was never buried, only hidden in the highlands, until the rest of us were ready to listen again. For over 1,000 years, the Book of Enoch lingered in obscurity, tucked away in the monasteries of Ethiopia, while the rest of the world forgot it even existed. Then, in the 18th century, it resurfaced, not in a cathedral, not in a council chamber, but in the hands of a Scottish explorer named James Bruce. He had gone in search of the Nile, and came back with something far stranger: 3 complete Ge'ez manuscripts of Enoch. Imagine Victorian scholars unrolling those fragile pages, reading about angels, giants, and apocalyptic visions that mirrored Revelation, and realizing this was no forgery. This was a book older than their own canon, a book that early Christians had known and later suppressed. A banned prophet had been raised from the dead. At first, the reaction was awkward. Many dismissed it as exotic folklore too strange to take seriously. But curiosity gnawed. The more linguists translated, the more theologians frowned, the more mystics whispered. The book's imagery of the Son of Man, enthroned beside the Ancient of Days, felt uncomfortably close to New Testament Christology. Its accounts of fallen angels teaching forbidden knowledge sounded like echoes of myths buried deep in human memory. Slowly, the book spread through Europe, feeding the imaginations of writers, philosophers, and fringe scholars who saw in it a missing piece of history. By the 19th century, Enoch was pulsing through apocalyptic movements, Millerites in America. Adventist preachers and countless visionaries mined it for prophecies of the end. It became fuel for revivalist fervor, proof that the ancients had known what was coming, and that judgment was not just metaphor, but timetable. At the same time, spiritualists and occultists seized upon it, claiming Enoch as a secret key to angelic communication numerology and the hidden architecture of the cosmos. For some, it was revelation. For others, it was rebellion. Either way, it refused to stay buried. And then came the 20th century. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s threw Enoch back into scholarly legitimacy. No longer just an Ethiopian anomaly, here were fragments of Enoch in Hebrew and Aramaic, proving it had once circulated widely in Second Temple Judaism. Suddenly, the text wasn't fringe. It was central to the world that gave birth to both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. And once again, questions surfaced. If the earliest believers revered Enoch, why had later generations banished him? If the text had shaped ideas of angels, demons, and the Messiah, could its removal have distorted the faith that followed modern readers? Of course, approach Enoch with varied lenses. Some see it as myth, a fascinating relic of apocalyptic imagination. Others see it as a suppressed chapter of divine revelation. Still others read it as allegory for corruption, heavenly beings standing in for dynasties, empires, and priestly elites. But whatever the interpretation, one fact is undeniable: the book has returned. And with it, the debates. Today, Enoch thrives in corners both academic and esoteric. Biblical scholars sift through its layers, tracing how its imagery shaped Revelation and how its cosmology influenced Jewish mysticism. Meanwhile, conspiracy theorists on late-night radio claim it holds proof of ancient aliens, pointing to the Watchers as extraterrestrials disguised in angelic robes. New Age mystics recite its passages as if they were mantras. Even pop culture borrows its imagery: giants, watchers, apocalypses, without ever admitting the source. It's a strange kind of resurrection. Not one commanded by bishops or decreed by emperors, but by curiosity, by longing, by the sense that something vital had been hidden and that history feels incomplete without it. Perhaps that's why the Book of Enoch always returns. You can chain the Watchers, you can flood the Nephilim, you can ban the text, but sooner or later, the story rises again because it never died. It was waiting like Enoch himself between worlds, ready to walk with us once more. And so the question lingers like a shadow at the edge of the page: was it rediscovered by accident? Or was it allowed to return right on schedule? By the time the 20th century closed, the Book of Enoch had become a battlefield. Not of swords or giants this time, but of interpretation. Scholars on one side, mystics on the other, each claiming the text as their own. Both poring over the same words, both convinced they had uncovered the true meaning. Both peering into a mirror that reflected whatever they were already prepared to see. In the scholarly world, Enoch is prized as a window into Second Temple Judaism. Academics dissect its layers: the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dreams, the Epistle of Enoch. They trace linguistic shifts, compare Aramaic fragments to Ethiopian manuscripts, reconstruct the worldview of sects like the Essenes. To them, Enoch is a historical document, a missing puzzle piece that explains how apocalyptic thought shaped the birth of Christianity. They write articles, footnote heavily and carefully separate myth from history. To read Enoch for them is to understand cultural evolution, not cosmic rebellion. Mystics, however, read differently. To them, Enoch isn't just history, it's instruction, a living text, alive with symbols and codes. The Watchers aren't merely fallen angels, they are archetypes of knowledge withheld and knowledge stolen. The chains of judgment aren't just imagery, they are energies still binding powers beneath the earth. The Son of Man isn't literary foreshadowing. He is prophecy unfolding still. Kabbalists, Sufis, esoteric Christians all have dipped into Enoch's well, pulling out water that glitters differently depending on the lantern they hold above it. This tension is hardly new. As early as the Renaissance, when fragments of Enoch began circulating again in Europe, mystics claimed him as their own. Alchemists saw in his visions a cipher for transmutation. Astrologers traced his descriptions of heavenly gates as proof of an ancient star map. Even secret societies whispered his name, linking him to lost temples, forbidden sciences, and the very foundations of human civilization. For them, Enoch wasn't a prophet. He was the architect of hidden wisdom. Scholars, of course, rolled their eyes. But here's the irony: both sides are right, and both sides are wrong. Because Enoch has always been a book of dual purpose. On the surface, it is apocalyptic literature meant to guide a persecuted people through despair with visions of divine justice. But beneath the surface, it is a book of symbols, metaphors, sharp enough to cut across centuries. When Enoch writes of stars that rebel, is he describing celestial beings or corrupt kings? When he warns of forbidden knowledge, is he indicting angelic defectors or human elites hoarding secrets? Both readings work. Both sting. And perhaps that's the book's enduring power. It resists ownership. Every attempt to nail it down, to box it into one meaning, collapses under the weight of its ambiguity. It can be history. It can be prophecy. It can be allegory. It can be all at once. The Watchers themselves might laugh at our attempts to choose. Modern debates often circle around one uncomfortable question: if Enoch was once revered as scripture, why isn't it read that way now? Scholars answer with canon politics. Mystics answer with conspiracy. But the deeper question isn't about authority, it's about fear. Because if Enoch is right, then the world isn't just corrupt, it's corrupted. Not by human weakness alone, but by powers that fell from the sky and still lurk beneath mountains. And if that's true, no council or creed can fully protect us from it. So who owns Enoch? The scholars with their translations and commentary, the mystics with their dreams and symbols, or perhaps neither? Perhaps the book belongs to those willing to sit in the tension, to admit that the line between metaphor and reality is thinner than we'd like. To recognize that a text powerful enough to be banned, preserved, rediscovered, and fought over for 2,000 years may not be fully claimed by anyone. Maybe the better question is not who owns Enoch, but who Enoch still owns. By now the threads are tangled. Angels who fell, giants who devoured, a flood that cleansed, a Messiah enthroned before time. Calendars that divide scrolls in caves, councils that banned monks who preserved mystics, who whispered scholars, who dissected. The Book of Enoch is less a single narrative than a labyrinth, a hall of mirrors, where every turn reflects another possibility. And yet when you step back, the outlines sharpen. A shape emerges. The book is telling us something clear. Something that frightened emperors, thrilled mystics, and refuses to die, even when buried for centuries. At its heart, Enoch reveals that the world is not stable. It is contested. Between heaven and earth, there is not harmony, but tension. Angels can fall. Men can rise. Knowledge can corrupt. Time itself can drift off its axis. The universe is not a machine ticking quietly in the background. It is a fragile system under strain, waiting for alignment or collapse. That alone is enough to make you sit a little straighter in your chair. The second truth is even sharper. Corruption is never only human. According to Enoch, what poisons creation doesn't come just from greed or envy or empire. It comes from elsewhere, from the sky, from beings who should have known better. The Watchers didn't tempt Adam in a garden. They seduced his daughters on a mountain. They didn't offer fruit. They offered secrets, technology, sorcery, adornment, bloodshed. Humanity wasn't only weak, it was tampered with, altered. That's a story you can't preach easily from a pulpit. And then comes the third truth: judgment is inevitable. Not arbitrary, not sudden, not capricious. Inevitable. The Watchers are chained, but the chains are temporary. The Nephilim are drowned, but their spirits still roam. The Son of Man sits beside the Ancient of Days, waiting for the number to be full. Enoch's apocalypse is not if, but when. It is less a warning than a reminder that the system will correct itself violently if necessary. Like a body rejecting infection. Like a sky spitting out those who no longer belong. But here's the thread that holds all the rest together. In Enoch, humanity is not forgotten. We are not spectators. We are participants. The flood wasn't meant to erase all life, only the corruption. The Messiah doesn't appear to save angels, but to vindicate mortals. The calendar of the righteous wasn't given to celestial beings. It was given to us. Beneath all the fire and fury, there is a strange tenderness. A belief that creation is worth saving. That humanity, though fragile, is still chosen. This perhaps is the most radical message of all. That a man immortal was invited into heaven, shown the machinery, entrusted with visions no one else had seen. Enoch wasn't a king or a priest or a warrior. He was simply the seventh from Adam. He walked with God, and God took him. If heaven trusted him, perhaps heaven can trust us too. That's what makes the book dangerous. Not the giants, not the angels, not the apocalyptic fire, but the suggestion that you and I are meant to walk closer to the divine than institutions want us to believe. So what does the Book of Enoch really tell us? That heaven and earth are bound in fragile tension. That corruption runs deeper than flesh. That judgment is not just threat, but promise. And that humanity is not powerless. We are remembered. We are recorded. We are part of the story. Perhaps that's why the book was banned. Not because it confused theology, but because it empowered believers. It reminded them that the throne is larger than empire, that the Messiah answers to no crown, that angels can fall and mortals can rise. Dangerous ideas, unless of course they're true. And if they are true, then Enoch is less a relic of the past and more a mirror of the present. A reminder that the Watchers have not been forgotten, that the Son of Man has not been dethroned, and that the book you were never meant to read might be telling you the one secret history that matters most. So here we are at the edge of the story. The scrolls have been unrolled, the visions recounted, the warnings weighed. Enoch has walked us through heaven and flood through angelic rebellion and messianic promise, through calendars and councils, caves and monasteries. And now in the quiet after the storm, one final thought lingers. What if the story was never just about the past? What if the Watchers never really left? The Book of Enoch insists their chains were temporary, that their judgment was delayed, not concluded, that their spirits, or at least the residue of their rebellion, still lingers in the world like smoke long after a fire has burned out. Some say they whisper in symbols in knowledge too advanced for its time. Others claim they move in shadows not seen, but felt their rebellion replaying in cycles of corruption empires and endless hunger for secrets. And when the Son of Man returns, it will not only be humanity that faces him, it will be them dragged from their prisons beneath mountains to stand once more before the throne. It's tempting to dismiss this as myth, as allegory. And maybe it is. But maybe that's the point. Myths, after all, are the way ancient peoples told truths too heavy to state outright. They wrapped them in giants and angels so that the story could survive long enough for us to ask what if, and now in the quiet of your room, you find yourself asking it too. What if the world really has been tampered with? What if the voices of the Watchers still echo in our obsession with forbidden knowledge, our relentless race for power, our fascination with the stars? What if their rebellion wasn't only history, but pattern? The answer may never come in headlines or excavations. It may not come in scrolls pulled from caves or manuscripts carried down mountains. It may come in silence, in dreams, in the way your skin prickles when you stand beneath a vast night sky, staring at constellations that Enoch once called living beings, watching, always watching. And so as the last page turns, let the noise fade. Let the fire die down. Let the giants shrink back into memory. The story of Enoch is not finished. It never was. It lingers, half warning, half promise. A reminder that humanity is not alone, that heaven and earth are bound by more than gravity, and that the lines between us and them were blurred long ago. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. The Watchers are still watching. Perhaps they always will. But then again, so is the Son of Man. And if Enoch was right, the ending is already written. So rest. You are part of the story too.